The year is 65 AD, and in the suburbs of Rome, an old man sits quietly in a warm bath as his life slowly drains away. The water around him turns crimson as he dictates his final thoughts to a secretary, his voice growing weaker with each passing moment. This is not the death of a coward or a criminal. This is the calculated end of one of history's most fascinating figures, a man who spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of Roman politics while preaching the virtues of wisdom, courage, and inner peace. His name was Lucius Annius Seneca, and his story reads like the most gripping political thriller ever written. Imagine a philosopher who advised emperors, a playwright who influenced Shakespeare, a businessman who accumulated vast wealth while teaching that money means nothing, and a teacher whose students included both saints and tyrants. This is a man who survived exile, assassination attempts, and the murderous whims of Caligula, only to become the most trusted advisor to one of history's most notorious rulers. But here's what makes Seneca's story truly extraordinary. He didn't just live through some of the most dramatic moments in Roman history. He helped shape them. His words guided the decisions of emperors, his wealth funded imperial campaigns, and his philosophy became the foundation for how Western civilization thinks about virtue, suffering, and the good life. Every time you hear someone talk about controlling what you can control and accepting what you cannot, you're hearing an echo of Seneca's voice from 2,000 years ago. The man we're about to meet was born into a world where philosophy wasn't just academic theory. It was a matter of life and death, a practical guide for surviving in a society where a single misstep could mean exile or execution. And Seneca didn't just study this philosophy from the safety of a classroom. He lived it in the corridors of power, tested it in the face of personal tragedy, and ultimately proved its worth by choosing how to die. Today, we're going to journey through the complete life of this remarkable figure, from his birth in the dusty hills of Spain to his final moments in that Roman bathroom. We'll see how a sickly child from the provinces became the most powerful man in the empire, how a teacher of virtue learned to navigate a world of corruption, and how a man who preached about the unimportance of material things became one of the richest people in Rome. This isn't just the story of one man, it's the story of how philosophy and power intersect, how wisdom and wealth can coexist, and how someone can maintain their principles while operating in a system designed to corrupt everyone it touches. By the time we're finished, you'll understand why Seneca remains one of the most quoted and controversial figures from the ancient world, and why his ideas about how to live continue to influence millions of people today. So settle in as we explore the extraordinary life of a man who proved that philosophy isn't just something you study, it's something you live, something you test, and if necessary, something you die for. Lucius Annius Seneca was born around 4 BC in Cordoba, modern-day Cordoba, in the Roman province of Hispania. This wasn't the cosmopolitan heart of the empire, but a dusty frontier town where Roman civilization met the rugged landscape of southern Spain. His father, Marcus Annius Seneca, known to history as Seneca the Elder, was already a distinguished figure in his own right, a teacher of rhetoric whose students would travel from across the empire to learn from him. The household young Lucius grew up in was one where words mattered, where the art of persuasion was studied with the same intensity that others might study warfare or commerce. His father had built a reputation training the sons of wealthy families to speak in the courts and the Senate, teaching them how to construct arguments that could sway judges and move crowds. The family library was filled with scrolls containing the speeches of Cicero, the histories of Livy, and the philosophical works that were shaping Roman intellectual life. But this was also a family that understood the practical realities of Roman society. Seneca's father wasn't just an academic. He was a man who had navigated the treacherous political landscape of the late Republic, who had seen civil wars tear the Roman world apart, and who understood that survival often depended on knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. These lessons about the intersection of wisdom and power would prove crucial for his son's future. Young Seneca had two brothers who would also achieve prominence. Novatus, later known as Gallio, would become a provincial governor and appears in the Bible as the Roman official who refused to prosecute the Apostle Paul. Mela, the youngest, would choose the life of a businessman and eventually father the poet Lucan, whose epic about Caesar's civil war would make him famous throughout the empire. But it was Lucius who showed the greatest promise and the most dangerous ambition. From his earliest years, Seneca was marked by two defining characteristics that would shape his entire life. The first was an insatiable hunger for knowledge and wisdom. He devoured philosophy the way other children might consume stories of adventure, finding in the teachings of the Stoics a framework for understanding the world and his place in it. The second characteristic was more troubling. His health was fragile, marked by respiratory problems that would plague him throughout his life and give him an intimate acquaintance with suffering from a young age. This combination of intellectual brilliance and physical weakness created a unique perspective. While other young Romans might dream of military glory or athletic achievement, Seneca was forced to find his strength in his mind. Philosophy wasn't just an intellectual exercise for him, it was a survival tool, a way of making sense of a body that betrayed him and a world that seemed designed to test him at every turn. The family's move to Rome when Seneca was still young marked the beginning of his formal education and his introduction to the complex world of imperial politics. Rome in the early 1st century AD was a city transformed. The chaos of the late Republic had given way to the stability of the Principate under Augustus, but this stability came at a cost. The old freedoms of the Republic were gone, replaced by the careful choreography of imperial rule. In this new Rome, success required a different set of skills than it had in the days of Cicero and Caesar. Raw ambition and military prowess were still important, but they had to be tempered with discretion, loyalty, and the ability to navigate the complex web of relationships that surrounded the imperial court. It was a world where a single misplaced word could mean exile or death, where fortunes could be made or lost based on the emperor's mood, and where even the most successful men lived with the constant awareness that their position was entirely dependent on imperial favour. Seneca's education in this environment was comprehensive and practical. He studied rhetoric with his father, learning how to construct arguments that could persuade judges and move audiences. He studied philosophy with the leading teachers of the day, absorbing not just Stoic doctrine, but also the teachings of other schools, developing the broad intellectual foundation that would later make his own philosophical writings so rich and compelling. But perhaps most importantly, he learned by observation. He watched how successful men behaved in the presence of power, how they balanced principle with pragmatism, how they survived in a system where loyalty was demanded but trust was rare. These lessons in practical wisdom would prove invaluable when he eventually found himself at the center of imperial politics. The philosophical school that captured Seneca's imagination and would define his worldview was Stoicism, a system of thought that had been developed in Athens centuries earlier but had found fertile ground in Roman soil. The Stoics taught that virtue was the only true good, that external things like wealth, health, and social position were neither inherently good nor bad, but simply preferred or dispreferred in difference. This might sound like abstract philosophical speculation, but for someone living in the dangerous world of imperial Rome, Stoicism offered profoundly practical guidance. If your position, your wealth, and even your life could be taken away at any moment by imperial whim, then finding your security in something that could never be taken from you, your character and your choices made perfect sense. The Stoics also taught that everything in the universe was connected, that events unfolded according to divine reason, and that the wise person would align themselves with this cosmic order rather than fighting against it. This didn't mean passive acceptance of whatever happened, but rather a focus on controlling what could be controlled, your thoughts, your actions, your responses, while accepting what could not be controlled, other people's behaviour, natural disasters, the rise and fall of empires. For a young man with chronic health problems, living in an unpredictable political environment, these teachings offered both comfort and guidance. They provided a framework for dealing with suffering, a philosophy of resilience that could help someone navigate the storms of life while maintaining their integrity and inner peace. But Seneca's attraction to Stoicism wasn't purely intellectual or emotional. He also recognized its practical value in Roman society. Stoicism had become the unofficial philosophy of the Roman elite, the worldview that helped senators and administrators maintain their composure while dealing with the pressures and responsibilities of governing an empire. To be recognized as a serious Stoic philosopher was to gain entry into the highest circles of Roman society. This combination of personal conviction and practical advantage would characterize much of Seneca's later life. He genuinely believed in Stoic principles, but he also understood how to use that belief to advance his position in a competitive and dangerous world. Critics would later accuse him of hypocrisy, of preaching virtue while accumulating wealth and power. But perhaps it's more accurate to say that he was trying to live according to Stoic principles, while fully engaging with the realities of Roman political life. As Seneca entered adulthood, his reputation as both a philosopher and an orator began to grow. His speeches in the courts were praised for their eloquence and learning. His philosophical writings began to circulate among educated Romans, and his name became associated with the intellectual vitality that characterized the early empire. He was building the kind of career that his father had dreamed of, combining practical success with intellectual achievement. But success in imperial Rome always came with risks, and Seneca was about to learn just how dangerous it could be to attract the attention of the wrong people. The Emperor Caligula, who had initially seemed like a promising young ruler, was descending into the madness and paranoia that would define his reign. And somehow, the brilliant young philosopher from Spain had managed to catch his notice in the worst possible way. The year 39 AD marked a turning point that would test everything Seneca had learned about Stoic philosophy and political survival. Caligula had been emperor for 2 years, and what had begun as a promising reign had devolved into something far more sinister. The young emperor, who had initially charmed Rome with his generosity and apparent sanity, was now revealing himself to be dangerously unstable, prone to fits of rage and increasingly paranoid about potential threats to his power. Seneca found himself caught in the emperor's crosshairs through no fault of his own, at least not in any conventional sense. His crime was excellence. His speeches in the Senate had been too eloquent, his philosophical writings too popular, his reputation too bright in a court where the emperor demanded to be the sole source of light. Caligula, who fancied himself an orator and intellectual, could not tolerate being overshadowed by anyone, least of all a provincial philosopher who had never commanded armies or conquered territories. The accusations came suddenly and without warning. Seneca was charged with adultery with Julia Livilla, one of Caligula's sisters. The evidence was thin to non-existent, the charges politically motivated, but in the imperial court of the 1st century, evidence was often less important than imperial displeasure. The penalty for such an offence was death, and Seneca found himself facing the very real possibility that his philosophical principles were about to be tested in the most final way possible. But fate, or perhaps the cosmic reason that the Stoics believed governed all things, intervened in an unexpected form. As Seneca awaited his fate, word reached the court that he was seriously ill. So ill that he might not survive much longer, regardless of any imperial sentence. His chronic respiratory problems had flared up, possibly exacerbated by the stress of his situation, and courtiers whispered that the emperor need not bother with an execution when nature would soon accomplish the same result. Caligula, always theatrical in his cruelties, decided that allowing Seneca to die slowly of disease would be a more fitting punishment than a quick execution. The emperor commuted the death sentence to exile, sending the philosopher to the barren island of Corsica with the expectation that the harsh conditions and isolation would finish what his illness had started. It was meant to be a death sentence with extra steps, a way for Caligula to appear merciful while still ensuring his rival's destruction. But Caligula had underestimated both Seneca's constitution and his character. The philosopher, who had spent years studying how to endure suffering, was about to get a practical education in his own teachings. Corsica, in 39 AD, was not a pleasant place for a Roman aristocrat accustomed to the comforts of urban life. The island was rocky, underdeveloped, and populated mainly by bandits and political exiles. There were no libraries, no intellectual companions, no comfortable villas with gardens and slaves to attend to daily needs. For most Romans of Seneca's class, such exile would have been devastating, a fall from grace so complete that many chose suicide rather than endure the humiliation. But Seneca approached his banishment with the systematic application of Stoic principles that would characterize his entire approach to adversity. He had no control over where he was or how long he would remain there, but he had complete control over how he responded to his circumstances. The letters and writings that survive from this period reveal a man working through the practical application of philosophical theory in real time. He wrote extensively about exile, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived experience. He explored questions about what constitutes home, whether happiness depends on external circumstances, and how someone can maintain their dignity and purpose even when stripped of everything that society considers important. But these weren't just intellectual exercises. They were survival strategies, ways of maintaining sanity and hope in circumstances designed to crush both. Seneca used his time in exile to deepen his understanding of Stoic philosophy, to write some of his most powerful works, and to prepare himself for whatever challenges might lie ahead. He couldn't know that his exile would last 8 years, or that his eventual recall would catapult him to heights of power he had never imagined, but he could focus on becoming the kind of person who would be ready for whatever fate had in store. The daily routine he established on Corsica became a template for how he would approach challenges throughout the rest of his life. He rose early to write, spending hours each day working on philosophical treatises that would later influence generations of thinkers. He maintained his physical health as much as possible, understanding that a sound mind required a sound body. He cultivated relationships with his fellow exiles, learning from their experiences and finding ways to be useful to them despite his own reduced circumstances. Most importantly, he used his exile as an opportunity for what the Stoics called negative visualization, the practice of imagining loss in order to better appreciate what you have and prepare for what you might lose. Seneca had now experienced firsthand what it meant to lose wealth, position, family, and homeland. He had learned that such losses, while painful, were not fatal to someone with the right mental preparation. This knowledge would prove invaluable when he eventually returned to Rome and found himself in positions where such losses were constant possibilities. The philosophical work he produced during his exile reveals a thinker grappling with real questions rather than abstract theories. His essay, To Helvia on Consolation, written to comfort his mother during his absence, explores how families can maintain their bonds despite physical separation. His Consolation to Polybius addresses questions about grief and loss, drawing on his own experience of being cut off from everything familiar. These works established him not just as a competent philosopher, but as someone who could translate philosophical principles into practical guidance for real human problems. As the years passed, Seneca's health, rather than deteriorating as Caligula had hoped, actually seemed to improve in the simpler environment of Corsica. The clean air and regular routine, combined with his disciplined approach to diet and exercise, helped manage his respiratory problems better than the polluted, stressful atmosphere of Rome had done. His intellectual reputation, rather than fading during his absence, actually grew as his writings circulated throughout the empire and established him as one of the leading Stoic voices of his generation. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the political situation was changing in ways that would eventually work to Seneca's advantage. Caligula's reign of terror continued to escalate, but it was also generating the kind of opposition that would ultimately prove fatal to the emperor. Senators who had initially supported him were beginning to whisper about the need for change, and members of the Praetorian Guard were growing tired of serving a ruler whose unpredictability made their own positions insecure. In January of 41 AD, those whispers turned into action. Caligula was assassinated by a conspiracy that included senators and Praetorian officers, ending one of the most bizarre and violent reigns in Roman history. The man who had sent Seneca into exile, who had terrorized the Roman elite for nearly 4 years, died in a hallway of his own palace, struck down by men who had finally decided that the emperor's madness posed too great a threat to the stability of the empire. The assassination of Caligula created a power vacuum that was quickly filled by an unlikely candidate. Claudius, the emperor's uncle, had been considered a harmless eccentric for most of his life, dismissed by the imperial family as too scholarly and physically awkward to be taken seriously as a political figure. But when the Praetorian Guard needed someone from the imperial family to legitimize their actions, Claudius was available, and more importantly, he was alive and unassociated with his nephew's crimes. The new emperor faced enormous challenges. He needed to restore confidence in imperial governance, repair relationships with the Senate, and somehow convince the Roman people that the imperial system could provide the stability it promised. One of his strategies for accomplishing these goals was to recall prominent exiles who had been banished by his predecessor, demonstrating both his mercy and his rejection of Caligula's arbitrary methods. For Seneca, rotting away on Corsica with no apparent prospect of return, the news of Caligula's death and Claudius's accession must have seemed like a gift from the gods. But the Stoic philosopher had learned not to pin his hopes on external events beyond his control. He had spent 8 years preparing himself to accept permanent exile if necessary, and he approached the possibility of recall with the same measured response he had brought to his banishment. The recall, when it finally came, arrived through channels that would prove crucial for Seneca's future. Agrippina the Younger, Claudius's ambitious wife, and the mother of a young boy named Nero, had been instrumental in securing Seneca's return to Rome. She had her own reasons for wanting the philosopher back in the capital, reasons that would soon become apparent, and that would bind Seneca's fate to one of history's most notorious imperial dynasties. The return journey from Corsica to Rome in 49 AD must have felt surreal to a man who had spent 8 years adjusting to the possibility that he might never see the capital again. As Seneca's ship approached the harbour at Ostia, he would have seen a city transformed by nearly a decade of Claudian rule. New aqueducts carried fresh water to expanded neighbourhoods. The harbour itself had been enlarged and improved, and the general prosperity that marked successful imperial reigns was evident everywhere. But the Rome that welcomed Seneca back was also a more dangerous place than the one he had left. The court of Claudius was dominated by powerful women and ambitious freedmen who wielded influence that would have been unthinkable in the Old Republic. Chief among these was Agrippina the Younger, the emperor's fourth wife, whose political acumen and ruthless determination made her one of the most formidable figures in the empire. Agrippina had not secured Seneca's recall out of philosophical admiration or simple mercy. She had plans for the distinguished exile, plans that centered around her 12-year-old son Nero, who she was determined to position as Claudius's heir, despite the emperor having a biological son of his own. She needed tutors for the boy who could provide not just education, but political legitimacy, men whose reputations for wisdom and virtue would reflect well on her son's character and preparation for rule. Seneca found himself appointed as Nero's tutor alongside Sextus Afranius Burrus, a stern military man who would handle the boy's political and administrative education, while Seneca focused on philosophy, rhetoric, and the broader intellectual formation that a future emperor would need. It was an extraordinary opportunity, the chance to shape the mind of someone who might one day rule the known world, but it was also an extraordinarily dangerous position that would tie Seneca's fate irrevocably to the imperial succession. The young Nero that Seneca encountered was in many ways a typical aristocratic Roman boy, bright and eager to please, but also showing signs of the vanity and self-indulgence that characterized his class. He had artistic interests that his family found somewhat embarrassing, a love of music and poetry that seemed frivolous compared to the serious business of governing an empire. But he was also quick-witted and charming, capable of the kind of intellectual engagement that made teaching him genuinely rewarding. Seneca approached his tutorial responsibilities with the same systematic method he had brought to his philosophical writing and his survival in exile. He designed a curriculum that would expose Nero to the best of Roman literature and philosophy, while also preparing him for the practical realities of imperial rule. They studied the speeches of Cicero and the histories of Livy, but they also discussed contemporary political challenges and the complex relationships between emperor, senate, and people that defined the Principate. The philosophical component of Nero's education was particularly important to Seneca. He saw an opportunity to create something that had never existed before, a philosopher king who would embody Stoic principles while wielding supreme power. The young prince showed genuine interest in philosophical questions, engaging seriously with concepts about virtue, duty, and the proper use of authority that formed the core of Seneca's worldview. But even as he worked to shape Nero's character, Seneca was learning harsh lessons about the realities of imperial family dynamics. Agrippina's ambitions for her son were matched only by her ruthlessness in pursuing them. She systematically eliminated potential rivals and obstacles to Nero's succession, using poison, false accusations, and political manipulation with a skill that would have impressed Machiavelli. Claudius's son Britannicus, the natural heir, found his position increasingly precarious as his stepmother maneuvered to secure the throne for her own child. Seneca watched these machinations with the complex feelings of someone caught between philosophical principles and political necessities. His Stoic training told him to focus on what he could control, his influence over Nero's education and character, while accepting what he could not control, the broader political dynamics of the imperial court. But he was also pragmatic enough to understand that his own survival and success depended on Agrippina's continued favour and Nero's eventual accession to power. The tension between these competing demands created internal conflicts that would plague Seneca throughout his time at court. How could he maintain his integrity while serving a system built on violence and deception? How could he preach virtue while benefiting from the crimes of others? How could he prepare Nero to be a good emperor while knowing that the path to the throne would inevitably involve the destruction of innocent people? These weren't abstract philosophical problems, but daily practical challenges that required constant navigation. When Agrippina asked for his support in her schemes against Britannicus, Seneca had to find ways to avoid direct complicity while not alienating the woman who controlled his access to power. When Nero showed signs of cruelty or vanity, Seneca had to correct him firmly enough to be effective, but gently enough to maintain their relationship and his influence. The years of Nero's education also saw Seneca's own position in Roman society continue to evolve. His philosophical writings, refined during his exile and enhanced by his proximity to power, were circulating widely and establishing him as one of the leading intellectual figures of his generation. His letters to friends and students, filled with practical advice about how to live according to Stoic principles, were being copied and shared throughout the educated classes. But perhaps most significantly, Seneca was accumulating wealth on a scale that would have been unimaginable during his exile on Corsica. His position as imperial tutor came with substantial financial rewards, but more importantly, it provided access to the kinds of business opportunities that were only available to those with connections at the highest levels of government. He invested in shipping, mining, and money-lending operations that generated enormous profits, making him one of the richest men in the empire. This accumulation of wealth created another source of internal tension for the Stoic philosopher. His writings consistently emphasized that external goods like money were indifferent to true happiness, that the wise person should be prepared to lose everything without losing their peace of mind. Yet here he was, actively pursuing and accumulating the very things his philosophy taught him to treat as unimportant. Seneca's defenders, both ancient and modern, have argued that his wealth was a tool rather than an end in itself, that he needed financial resources to maintain his influence and independence in a system where poverty meant powerlessness. His critics have seen hypocrisy, a man who preached virtue while practicing vice, who taught others to despise what he himself desperately pursued. The truth, as often happens with complex historical figures, probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Seneca genuinely believed in Stoic principles and tried to live according to them, but he also understood that complete philosophical purity might mean abandoning any chance to influence events or protect the people he cared about. He made compromises that allowed him to remain effective in a compromised system, but those compromises came with psychological and moral costs that his writings suggest he felt keenly. The culmination of this period came in 54 AD, when Claudius died, almost certainly poisoned by Agrippina to prevent him from changing his mind about the succession. Nero, still only 16 years old, became emperor with Seneca and Burrus as his primary advisors. The boy that Seneca had been teaching for 5 years was now the most powerful person in the world, and the philosopher who had spent 8 years in exile was suddenly one of the most influential men in the empire. The early years of Nero's reign, which historians later called the Quinquennium Neronese, the 5 good years of Nero, represented the closest thing to a philosopher king that the Roman world would ever see. With Seneca providing intellectual guidance and Burrus handling military and administrative matters, the young emperor seemed to embody the Stoic ideal of a ruler who governed for the benefit of his subjects, rather than his own glory. Nero's speeches to the Senate, largely written by Seneca, emphasized themes of cooperation, respect for traditional institutions, and the emperor's role as servant of the people rather than their master. Legal reforms were implemented that protected slaves from the worst abuses of their owners, that streamlined court procedures, and that reduced the arbitrary power that had characterized previous reigns. The economy flourished, the frontiers remained secure, and Romans began to feel that the imperial system might actually deliver on its promises of peace and prosperity. But even during this golden period, there were warning signs that troubled those who knew how to read them. Nero's artistic interests, which Seneca had initially encouraged as a harmless outlet for the young man's creativity, were beginning to consume more and more of his attention. He spent hours practicing his singing and lyre playing, wrote poetry that courtiers were expected to praise regardless of its quality, and showed an increasing interest in public performance that horrified traditional Romans who believed that emperors should maintain their dignity above such common entertainments. More troubling was the gradual deterioration of Nero's relationship with his mother. Agrippina had engineered his rise to power, but she expected to continue controlling his decisions now that he was emperor. As Nero matured and began to assert his independence, conflicts arose that would eventually tear the imperial family apart and drag everyone in their orbit, including Seneca, into a vortex of violence and betrayal that would make his exile on Corsica seem like a peaceful retreat. The philosopher who had spent years teaching the young emperor about virtue, duty, and the proper use of power was about to learn that some students, no matter how carefully taught, will ultimately choose their own path. And that path would test not only Nero's character, but also Seneca's ability to maintain his principles while serving a ruler who was gradually revealing himself to be everything a Stoic emperor should not be. The transformation of Nero from philosopher student to absolute ruler didn't happen overnight, but the signs were there for anyone willing to see them. Seneca, who had spent countless hours in private tutorials discussing the nature of virtue and the responsibilities of power, began to notice subtle changes in his former pupil's behaviour that would have been alarming in anyone, but were terrifying in someone who commanded legions. The first cracks in the carefully constructed facade appeared around 55 AD, just a year into Nero's reign. The young emperor had fallen under the influence of Poppaea Sabina, a beautiful and ambitious woman who was everything Agrippina was not. Where his mother was calculating and political, Poppaea was sensual and immediate. Where Agrippina demanded respect for tradition and duty, Poppaea encouraged indulgence and pleasure. For a teenage emperor discovering the intoxicating combination of unlimited power and adult desires, the choice between these influences was perhaps inevitable. Seneca watched this development with the growing unease of a teacher who realizes his lessons are being forgotten in favor of more appealing instruction. He had spent years trying to instill in Nero an understanding that true power came from self-control, that the greatest emperors were those who governed themselves before attempting to govern others. But Poppaea's influence was pulling the young ruler in exactly the opposite direction, toward the belief that imperial power existed to satisfy imperial desires. The conflict came to a head over Nero's marriage to Octavia, Claudius's daughter, a political union that had been arranged to strengthen his claim to the throne. The marriage had never been happy. Octavia was dutiful but cold, more interested in maintaining her dignity than in providing the kind of passionate companionship that Nero craved. Poppaea, still married to her own husband, but increasingly bold in her pursuit of the emperor, began suggesting that a truly powerful ruler should not be bound by marriages of convenience. Seneca found himself in an impossible position. His philosophical principles told him that marriage vows were sacred, that duty should triumph over desire, and that an emperor who abandoned his wife for a mistress was setting a dangerous precedent for the kind of arbitrary behaviour that destroyed republics and corrupted empires. But his political instincts warned him that opposing Nero's desires too directly might cost him his influence entirely, leaving the young emperor with no moderating voice at all. The compromise he attempted was characteristic of his approach to the moral complexities of imperial service. Rather than forbidding Nero's relationship with Poppaea, he tried to channel it in less destructive directions. He argued that the emperor could maintain his marriage to Octavia for political reasons while pursuing his personal happiness privately. That discretion, rather than divorce, was the path of wisdom for someone whose every action was scrutinized by enemies looking for signs of weakness or scandal. But this careful balancing act satisfied no one. Agrippina saw Seneca's failure to completely oppose Poppaea as a betrayal of their alliance and began plotting to remove him from his position of influence. Poppaea viewed his counsels of moderation as obstacles to her ambitions and worked to convince Nero that his old tutor was trying to control him out of jealousy and outdated moral prejudices. Nero himself, caught between competing pressures and increasingly resentful of anyone who attempted to limit his freedom, began to see Seneca's philosophical advice as tedious lecturing from someone who didn't understand what it meant to be young and powerful. The situation deteriorated rapidly throughout 55 and into 56 AD. Agrippina, desperate to maintain her influence over her son, made the fatal mistake of threatening to support Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, as a rival claimant to the throne. It was probably an empty threat, intended to shock Nero into compliance, but it was interpreted by the emperor and his advisors as a genuine attempt at revolution. The young man who had once listened respectfully to Seneca's lessons about justice and mercy decided that his stepbrother represented an unacceptable threat to his security. The murder of Britannicus at a dinner party in early 55 AD marked the end of any pretense that Nero's reign would be guided by philosophical principles. The poison that killed the 14-year-old boy was administered in full view of the imperial family, a demonstration of power that was meant to intimidate potential rivals and establish beyond doubt who truly controlled the empire. Seneca, present at the dinner, watched his former student cross a line that no amount of philosophical training could uncross. The official story was that Britannicus had died of an epileptic seizure, a fiction that everyone present was expected to accept regardless of what they had witnessed. Seneca found himself faced with a choice that would define the rest of his relationship with Nero. He could speak out against the obvious murder, knowing that doing so would likely cost him his position and possibly his life, or he could remain silent and become complicit in the crime through his inaction. He chose silence, a decision that would haunt him for the remaining years of his life. His defenders have argued that speaking out would have accomplished nothing except his own destruction, that maintaining his influence over Nero, however diminished, was more important than making a futile gesture of moral purity. His critics have seen cowardice, a philosopher who abandoned his principles when they conflicted with his safety and comfort. The truth, as Seneca himself seemed to recognize in his later writings, was probably more complex. He had spent years believing that he could guide Nero toward virtue through patient instruction and moral example, that the philosophical education he had provided would ultimately triumph over the corrupting influences of absolute power. Britannicus's murder forced him to confront the possibility that he had been wrong, that some people are simply incapable of being reformed no matter how carefully they are taught. But rather than abandoning his position, Seneca chose to continue serving as Nero's advisor, telling himself that even a partially restrained tyrant was better than an unrestrained one. He worked with Burrus to manage the worst aspects of Nero's behavior, to channel the emperor's energies into relatively harmless pursuits, and to maintain some semblance of rational governance despite the growing chaos at the heart of the imperial court. This period of Seneca's life reveals the fundamental tension that had always existed in his character between philosophical idealism and political pragmatism. His letters and essays from this time show a man struggling to reconcile his Stoic beliefs with the realities of serving a ruler who embodied everything his philosophy opposed. He wrote extensively about the nature of moral compromise, about how a wise person should behave when forced to operate within corrupt systems, about the difference between what is ideal and what is possible. These writings, while personally agonizing for Seneca, proved remarkably influential for later generations of thinkers who found themselves in similar situations. His exploration of how someone could maintain their integrity while serving flawed institutions provided a framework that would be used by philosophers, courtiers, and administrators throughout history who faced the choice between moral purity and practical effectiveness. Meanwhile, Nero's transformation continued to accelerate. The young man who had once shown genuine interest in philosophical questions was becoming increasingly absorbed in his artistic pursuits and his relationship with Poppaea. He spent hours each day practicing his singing, commissioned elaborate theatrical productions in which he starred, and began making plans for public performances that would scandalize traditional Roman sensibilities. Seneca watched these developments with growing alarm, recognizing that Nero's obsession with performance was more than just a harmless hobby. The emperor was beginning to see his entire reign as a kind of theatrical production, with himself as the star and the Roman people as his audience. This perspective made rational governance increasingly difficult, as policy decisions were evaluated not for their practical effectiveness, but for their dramatic impact. The relationship between Seneca and his former student became increasingly strained as the philosopher's attempts at guidance were met with irritation and resentment. Nero had grown tired of being lectured about virtue and duty by someone he now saw as a relic from his childhood, an old man whose outdated ideas were obstacles to his self-expression and happiness. The respectful student had been replaced by an emperor who tolerated no criticism and interpreted any attempt at guidance as an insult to his authority. By 58 AD, the situation had become untenable for everyone involved. Agrippina, having lost her influence over her son, was plotting desperately to regain her position or remove him from power entirely. Poppaea was pressuring Nero to divorce Octavia and marry her, damn the political consequences. The Senate and people were growing restless as reports of the emperor's behaviour spread throughout the empire, and Seneca found himself caught in the middle of conflicts that seemed to have no resolution except violence. The explosion, when it finally came, would be more terrible than anyone had imagined, and it would force the Stoic philosopher to confront the ultimate question about his life's work. Had his years of teaching and guidance accomplished anything at all? Or had he simply enabled a monster by providing him with the intellectual tools to justify his crimes? The answer to that question would determine not only how history judged Seneca, but how he would judge himself in the dark years that lay ahead. The year 59 AD would mark the point of no return for both Nero and his former teacher. The emperor had grown increasingly impatient with what he saw as the obstacles to his happiness, chief among them his mother Agrippina, whose constant interference and threats had become intolerable to a young man drunk on absolute power. The woman who had orchestrated his rise to the throne, who had eliminated his rivals and secured his position, had become the greatest threat to his freedom to rule as he chose. Seneca could see the storm building. The philosophical discussions that had once occupied hours of their time together had been replaced by brief, tense meetings where the emperor's attention wandered constantly to other concerns. When Nero did engage with serious matters of governance, it was with the impatience of someone who viewed such responsibilities as interruptions to more important pursuits. The careful balance that had characterized the early years of the reign was crumbling, and Seneca found himself increasingly unable to influence events that were spiraling toward catastrophe. The murder of Agrippina, when it finally came, was planned with a theatrical flair that revealed just how completely Nero had abandoned any pretense of conventional imperial behavior. Rather than the simple poison that had dispatched Britannicus, the emperor devised an elaborate scheme involving a collapsible boat that would appear to sink accidentally during a festival celebrating the goddess Minerva. The plan was simultaneously clever and absurd, typical of a mind that had come to see even murder as a form of artistic expression. But the boat plan failed. Agrippina survived the staged shipwreck and swam to shore, forcing Nero to abandon subtlety in favour of direct action. He sent soldiers to her villa with orders to complete what the sabotaged vessel had failed to accomplish. The woman who had been the most powerful figure in Rome after the emperor himself was hacked to death by Praetorian guards acting on her son's explicit command. For Seneca, Witnessing this matricide represented the complete failure of everything he had tried to accomplish during his years as Nero's tutor. The young man he had attempted to shape into a philosopher king had become exactly the kind of tyrant that Stoic philosophy was designed to oppose. Every lesson about virtue, every discussion of the proper use of power, every careful explanation of why rulers must constrain themselves, had been swept away by the intoxicating combination of unlimited authority and personal desire. The aftermath of Agrippina's murder created a crisis that tested everyone in Nero's inner circle. The emperor himself seemed genuinely surprised by the negative reaction his mother's death provoked among both the Roman elite and the common people. He had expected relief that a manipulative and dangerous woman had been removed from the political scene. Instead, he found himself facing whispered accusations of the most heinous crime imaginable in Roman culture, the killing of one's own parents. Seneca found himself in the impossible position of having to help craft the official explanation for an act he privately considered monstrous. The story they constructed painted Agrippina as a would-be assassin who had been plotting against her son's life, a narrative that justified her death as necessary self-defense. Seneca's rhetorical skills, honed through decades of philosophical writing and legal advocacy, were pressed into service to make the unbelievable seem plausible. The letter he wrote to the Senate explaining the emperor's actions is one of the most morally complex documents in ancient literature. On its surface, it's a masterpiece of persuasive writing that successfully convinced the Senate to officially thank Nero for preserving his own life and the stability of the empire. But reading between the lines reveals a man in spiritual agony, using his considerable talents to defend actions he knew were indefensible. This period marked the beginning of Seneca's gradual withdrawal from active involvement in imperial governance. He continued to serve as Nero's advisor, but his influence waned as the emperor surrounded himself with people who encouraged rather than restrained his worst impulses. Poppeia's ascendancy was complete now that Agrippina was gone, and she had no interest in maintaining the philosophical atmosphere that had characterized the early years of the reign. The changes in Nero's behavior accelerated after his mother's death. Freed from the last significant check on his power, he began to indulge his artistic ambitions more openly. He started performing in public, initially in private venues for carefully selected audiences, but gradually working his way up to appearances in major theatres where ordinary Romans could witness their emperor singing and playing the lyre like a common entertainer. These performances horrified the traditional Roman elite, who saw them as degrading to the imperial dignity that was supposed to elevate the emperor above ordinary mortals. But Nero was beyond caring about such conventional concerns. He had discovered that the applause of crowds provided a satisfaction that governing could not match, and he began to organize his entire schedule around opportunities to perform rather than the mundane business of running an empire. Seneca watched this transformation with the complex emotions of someone who had invested years of effort in a project that was not merely failing but becoming its opposite. The young man he had tried to educate in virtue was becoming a living refutation of everything Stoic philosophy taught about the relationship between wisdom and power. Every public performance, every indulgence, every abandonment of duty was a rejection of the lessons Seneca had tried so hard to instill. But the philosopher was trapped by his own success. His wealth, accumulated during the years of influence, made him one of the richest men in the empire, but also one of the most vulnerable to imperial displeasure. His estates, his business interests, his very life depended on maintaining at least the appearance of loyalty to an emperor whose behavior he increasingly found repugnant. The Stoic, who had written extensively about the unimportance of external goods, found himself unable to abandon those goods without risking everything he had built. The internal tension this created is evident in the philosophical works Seneca produced during this period. His letters to Lucilius, a friend and fellow student of philosophy, reveal a man struggling to apply Stoic principles to situations the ancient founders of the school had never imagined. How does one maintain virtue while serving vice? How does one preserve integrity while participating in a system built on corruption and violence? These were not abstract questions for Seneca, but daily practical challenges that determined how he spent his time and energy. His solution, characteristically complex, was to continue serving Nero while gradually reducing his involvement in the most morally compromising aspects of imperial policy. He focused increasingly on administrative and financial matters where his skills could benefit the empire without requiring him to endorse or participate in the emperor's personal crimes. It was a form of damage control, an attempt to preserve what good he could while limiting his complicity in what he could not prevent. This balancing act became increasingly difficult as Nero's behavior grew more erratic and dangerous. The emperor's relationship with Poppaea had evolved from passion to obsession, and he was determined to marry her regardless of the political consequences. This required divorcing Octavia, his current wife, and finding a way to neutralize the popular sympathy she enjoyed as the daughter of the beloved Claudius and the victim of her husband's neglect. The divorce proceedings revealed Nero's complete abandonment of any pretense of constitutional governance. When the Senate proved reluctant to approve the dissolution of his marriage, he simply declared it dissolved and proceeded with plans for his wedding to Poppaea. When Octavia's supporters protested, he accused her of adultery and treason, charges that everyone knew were fabricated but that no one dared challenge openly. Seneca found himself once again called upon to provide intellectual justification for actions he personally opposed. The philosophical arguments he constructed for the emperor's right to choose his own wife drew on Stoic teachings about the primacy of reason over convention. But applying these principles to justify what was essentially an arbitrary abuse of power required logical contortions that must have pained their author. The wedding itself, celebrated with elaborate ceremonies that emphasized Poppaea's elevation to imperial status, marked another milestone in Nero's transformation from ruler to performer. The events were staged with the kind of attention to theatrical detail that characterized all of the emperor's public appearances, complete with carefully choreographed processions and spectacles designed to dazzle the Roman people into accepting what their traditional values told them was wrong. But the most disturbing aspect of this period was not Nero's personal behavior, but the way his example was corrupting the broader imperial system. Governors and administrators throughout the empire, seeing that the emperor valued theatrical flair over administrative competence, began adopting similar approaches to their own responsibilities. The careful, methodical governance that had characterized the early empire was giving way to a more arbitrary and unpredictable style that prioritized dramatic effect over practical results. Seneca could see the damage this was causing to the institutions he had spent his career trying to strengthen and preserve. The respect for law that underpinned Roman civilization was being eroded by an emperor who treated legal and moral constraints as obstacles to his self-expression. The loyalty of the legions, traditionally focused on Rome itself, was being redirected toward the personal glorification of a ruler whose behavior many soldiers found embarrassing and disturbing. Most troubling of all was the way Nero's conduct was affecting the relationship between the emperor and the Roman people. The traditional compact between ruler and ruled, based on the emperor's promise to provide security and prosperity in exchange for obedience and respect, was breaking down as it became clear that Nero was more interested in personal satisfaction than public service. The grumbling that had initially been confined to aristocratic circles was beginning to spread to the broader population as the consequences of imperial self-indulgence became impossible to ignore. By 62 AD, Seneca's position had become almost entirely ceremonial. He retained his titles and formal access to the emperor, but his advice was rarely sought and even more rarely followed. Nero had surrounded himself with a new circle of advisors whose primary qualification was their willingness to encourage rather than restrain his impulses. The careful system of checks and balances that had characterized the early years of the reign had been dismantled in favor of a more direct and personal form of rule. The death of Burrus in that same year removed Seneca's last significant ally in the struggle to moderate Nero's behavior. The stern military commander who had helped manage the practical aspects of governance, while Seneca focused on intellectual and moral guidance, was replaced by men whose loyalty was purchased rather than earned. The partnership that had made the Quinquennium Neronis possible was definitively over, leaving Seneca isolated and increasingly irrelevant in a court that had moved beyond any interest in philosophical restraint. The philosopher who had once believed he could shape the character of an emperor through patient education and moral example was finally forced to confront the possibility that he had been fundamentally wrong about human nature and the relationship between knowledge and behavior. All his years of teaching, all his carefully crafted lessons about virtue and duty, all his attempts to demonstrate through personal example what it meant to live according to philosophical principles, had failed to prevent Nero from becoming exactly the kind of ruler that Stoic theory condemned. This recognition created a crisis that went to the heart of everything Seneca believed about philosophy and its practical application. If wisdom could not triumph over power, if virtue could not restrain vice, if the most careful education could not prevent the corruption that seemed to inevitably accompany unlimited authority, then what was the point of philosophical study at all? These questions would dominate the final phase of his life, as he struggled to find meaning in what appeared to be the complete failure of his life's work. The answer to those questions would come sooner than Seneca expected, but not in the way he had hoped. As 62 AD drew to a close, the philosopher found himself wrestling with a decision that would define the final chapter of his extraordinary life. The empire he had served, the student he had taught, the system he had tried to reform from within had all moved beyond his ability to influence or control. The time had come to choose between continued complicity and principled withdrawal. The catalyst for this decision came from an unexpected source. Nero, perhaps recognizing that his former tutor's disapproval was becoming an embarrassment in a court dedicated to flattery and indulgence, began making subtle suggestions that Seneca might want to consider retirement. These hints, delivered with the kind of casual menace that had become characteristic of the emperor's communication style, carried an unmistakable message. The philosopher's continued presence was no longer welcome, and his departure could be voluntary or involuntary depending on his response to imperial preference. For most courtiers, such a suggestion would have been terrifying, a thinly veiled threat that demanded immediate compliance. But Seneca, drawing on the philosophical training that had sustained him through exile and political crisis, saw something different in Nero's words. He saw an opportunity to finally align his actions with his beliefs, to choose principle over pragmatism in a way that might redeem the compromises of his later years. The request for retirement that Seneca submitted to Nero in early 62 AD was a masterpiece of diplomatic language that managed to be both respectful and subtly critical. He acknowledged his debt to the emperor for years of favour and advancement, expressed gratitude for the wealth and position he had been allowed to accumulate, and requested permission to withdraw from active service to focus on philosophical contemplation and writing. But beneath the courteous surface lay a more complex message about the proper relationship between wisdom and power, duty and desire. Nero's response revealed both his intelligence and his fundamental misunderstanding of his former teacher's character. Rather than simply granting the request, The emperor delivered a lengthy speech designed to demonstrate his rhetorical skills while rejecting Seneca's petition for withdrawal. He argued that the philosopher's experience and wisdom were too valuable to the empire to be wasted in retirement, that personal loyalty demanded continued service, and that abandoning his responsibilities would be a betrayal of everything they had worked to accomplish together. The speech was skillfully crafted, drawing on techniques Seneca himself had taught years earlier, but it missed the essential point of the philosopher's request. Nero seemed to believe that his former tutor's desire for retirement was motivated by fear or disappointment rather than principle, that the right combination of flattery and implicit threat would convince him to remain at court. He offered guarantees of continued favour, promises of reduced responsibilities, and assurances that past disagreements would be forgotten if Seneca would simply agree to stay. But the old philosopher had moved beyond concern for imperial favour or personal safety. His request for retirement was not a negotiating position, but a statement of moral necessity, a recognition that continued service under current conditions would require compromises he was no longer willing to make. The years of trying to balance Stoic principles with political realities had taught him that such balance was ultimately impossible when serving a ruler who acknowledged no constraints on his power or behaviour. Seneca's response to Nero's rejection was characteristically subtle and philosophically grounded. Rather than arguing directly with the emperor's decision, he simply began reducing his involvement in court affairs while maintaining the forms of respect and loyalty that protocol demanded. He attended fewer meetings, offered less advice, and gradually withdrew from the daily business of governance while never openly defying imperial wishes. This careful retreat allowed him to preserve his dignity while avoiding direct confrontation with an increasingly unstable ruler. He used the time gained from reduced official duties to focus on the philosophical writing that had always been his primary passion, producing during this period some of his most profound meditations on virtue, mortality, and the proper way to live in an imperfect world. The letters to Lucilius that emerged from this time reveal a man who had found peace with his situation, despite its obvious dangers and disappointments. Writing with the freedom that comes from having nothing left to lose, Seneca explored questions about duty and conscience, about the relationship between personal integrity and public service, about how someone should behave when forced to operate within systems they fundamentally oppose. These works show a philosopher who had learned hard lessons about the limits of human influence, but who remained committed to the belief that individual virtue mattered regardless of external circumstances. He wrote extensively about the importance of maintaining one's principles, even when those principles seem to accomplish nothing, about finding meaning in right action rather than successful outcomes, about the satisfaction that comes from aligning one's behaviour with one's beliefs regardless of what others might think or do. But even as Seneca found intellectual and spiritual satisfaction in his partial withdrawal from court life, the political situation around him continued to deteriorate. Nero's behaviour grew more erratic and self-indulgent with each passing month, his performances more frequent and elaborate, his neglect of governmental responsibilities more obvious to everyone except himself. The emperor, who had once shown promise as a philosopher king, was becoming a cautionary tale about the corrupting effects of absolute power. The broader consequences of this imperial transformation were becoming visible throughout the empire. Provincial governors, lacking clear guidance from Rome, began making increasingly arbitrary decisions based on their understanding of what might please an unpredictable emperor. The Senate, cowed by years of intimidation and uncertain about what policies to support, retreated into the kind of passive compliance that made effective governance impossible. Most troubling of all was the growing disconnect between the imperial court and the Roman people. Nero's artistic ambitions, which had initially seemed like harmless eccentricities, were consuming increasing amounts of public resources while contributing nothing to the security and prosperity that ordinary citizens expected from their government. The elaborate theatres and performance venues, the costly festivals and competitions, the imported artists and musicians all came at the expense of more practical concerns like infrastructure maintenance and military preparedness. Seneca watched these developments with the complex emotions of someone who had invested decades in trying to prevent exactly this kind of decline. His philosophical training told him to accept what he could not control while focusing on what remained within his power to influence. But his practical experience and genuine concern for the empire's welfare made it impossible to remain completely detached from events that seemed to be leading toward catastrophe. The fire that consumed much of Rome in July of 64 AD provided a dramatic illustration of how far the imperial system had drifted from its original purposes. Whether or not Nero actually started the blaze, as his enemies claimed, his response to the disaster revealed the fundamental selfishness that now guided his decisions. Rather than focusing entirely on relief efforts and reconstruction, the emperor saw the destruction as an opportunity to build monuments to his own glory on the cleared land. The famous Golden House that Nero constructed in the aftermath of the fire was everything that Seneca's philosophical teachings had warned against. It was a monument to excess and self-indulgence, a massive complex of buildings and gardens designed primarily to showcase the emperor's wealth and artistic pretensions. The resources that went into its construction could have rebuilt entire neighborhoods destroyed by the flames, but Nero was more interested in creating a setting worthy of his performances than in addressing the practical needs of his subjects. For Seneca, witnessing this response to genuine human suffering must have been particularly painful. He had spent years trying to teach Nero that true greatness came from service to others rather than self-glorification, that the measure of a ruler was not the magnificence of his palaces, but the welfare of his people. The Golden House represented the complete rejection of everything those lessons had attempted to convey. But perhaps even more disturbing than Nero's selfish response to the fire was his decision to blame the Christians for the disaster. The persecution that followed was notable not just for its cruelty, but for its arbitrariness, targeting a religious minority that posed no real threat to imperial authority simply because they provided a convenient scapegoat for policies that had contributed to the city's vulnerability. Seneca had always been troubled by unnecessary violence, viewing it as a sign of weakness rather than strength in those who employed it. The systematic torture and execution of innocent people for crimes they had not committed violated every principle of justice and rationality that he had tried to instill in his former student. It was the kind of arbitrary cruelty that the Stoics believed was incompatible with true authority and genuine strength. The philosopher's response to these events was characteristically complex. He could not openly criticize the emperor's actions without risking his own safety and that of his family and friends, but he could not remain entirely silent in the face of what he recognized as fundamental moral failure. His solution was to focus even more intensively on his writing, producing works that explored questions about justice, mercy, and the proper use of power without directly addressing current events. These philosophical treatises, while ostensibly abstract, carried clear implications for anyone willing to read carefully. His discussions of tyranny and its effects on both rulers and subjects, his explorations of the relationship between power and virtue, his meditations on the importance of maintaining moral principles even in difficult circumstances, all spoke to contemporary issues without explicitly challenging imperial policy. This indirect approach allowed Seneca to maintain his intellectual integrity while avoiding direct confrontation with an increasingly dangerous ruler. but it also highlighted the fundamental limitation of philosophical influence in a system where ultimate authority rested with someone who acknowledged no constraints on his behavior. Words, however eloquent or wise, could not compete with the immediate satisfaction that came from exercising unlimited power without regard for consequences or conventional morality. The growing isolation of Nero's court became more pronounced as the emperor's behavior alienated even his most loyal supporters. The senators and administrators who had initially been willing to overlook his eccentricities in exchange for imperial favor began to recognize that association with the regime was becoming more dangerous than opposition. Plots and conspiracies multiplied as it became clear that the current system was unsustainable and that change, whether voluntary or forced, was inevitable. Seneca found himself in an increasingly precarious position as these undercurrents of discontent swirled around the court. His reputation for wisdom and integrity made him a natural focal point for those seeking alternatives to Nero's rule. But his years of service to the emperor also made him suspect to anyone planning serious resistance. He was too prominent to be ignored, too compromised to be trusted, and too dangerous to be left alone. The conspiracy that would ultimately cost Seneca his life began to take shape in 64 AD, though the philosopher himself remained largely unaware of its existence. Led by Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a senator whose family had ancient claims to respectability, the plot aimed to assassinate Nero and install a more traditional ruler who would restore the dignity and effectiveness that had characterized earlier imperial reigns. The conspirators faced a fundamental problem that had plagued every attempt to remove Nero from power. The emperor's popularity with certain segments of the population, particularly those who enjoyed his theatrical performances and generous entertainments, made it difficult to present his assassination as liberation rather than murder. Any successful coup would need to be followed immediately by reforms that demonstrated the superiority of the new regime, and this required leaders whose competence and integrity were beyond question. Piso himself, while respectable, lacked the kind of commanding presence that could unite the empire behind a new direction. The conspiracy needed figures whose reputations for wisdom and virtue could legitimize the violent overthrow of an established government. Unfortunately for Seneca, his decades of prominence and his reputation as a moral authority made him exactly the kind of person the conspirators needed, whether he wanted to be involved or not. The philosopher's actual role in the conspiracy remains one of the most debated questions in ancient history. Some sources suggest that he was approached by the conspirators and gave them encouragement, if not active support. Others maintain that he remained entirely ignorant of their plans and was targeted by Nero simply because his presence represented an implicit criticism of imperial behavior. The truth, as often happens with events from this period, was probably somewhere between these extremes. What seems most likely is that Seneca was aware of the growing discontent with Nero's rule and may have expressed sympathy for those seeking change, but that he was not directly involved in planning any specific action against the emperor. His philosophical principles would have made it difficult for him to endorse assassination as a solution to political problems, while his practical experience would have warned him against involvement in conspiracies that seemed unlikely to succeed. But in the paranoid atmosphere that surrounded Nero's court by 65 AD, such distinctions mattered less than appearances and associations. The emperor had grown increasingly suspicious of anyone whose loyalty was not absolute and unquestioning, and Seneca's partial withdrawal from active service had been interpreted as evidence of disloyalty rather than principle. When the conspiracy was discovered and its participants arrested, it was perhaps inevitable that the philosopher would be swept up in the investigation, regardless of his actual involvement. The denunciations that followed the conspiracy's exposure revealed the extent to which fear had corrupted the relationships between even long-time associates and friends. Faced with torture and execution, many of those arrested provided information about others who might have been sympathetic to the plot, whether or not they had actually participated in planning it. Seneca's name appeared on multiple lists, sometimes as an active conspirator, sometimes as a sympathetic observer, sometimes simply as someone whose continued existence posed a threat to imperial security. When the summons finally came for Seneca to appear before Nero and answer questions about his loyalty, both men understood that this was not really an investigation, but a formality preceding a predetermined conclusion. The emperor had decided that his former tutor could no longer be allowed to live, whether because of actual treason or simply because his presence served as an uncomfortable reminder of higher standards that the current regime had abandoned. The final meeting between the teacher and his student was conducted with the kind of elaborate courtesy that had characterized their relationship even during its most strained periods. Nero did not rage or threaten, but simply presented the evidence that had been gathered and asked for an explanation. Seneca, understanding that no explanation would be acceptable, responded with the kind of philosophical dignity that he had been cultivating throughout his adult life. The charges, such as they were, focused less on specific acts of treason than on Seneca's general attitude toward the imperial government. His partial withdrawal from court activities was presented as evidence of disloyalty. His philosophical writings were interpreted as veiled criticism of current policies, and his continued influence with other senators was portrayed as a threat to imperial authority. It was the kind of case that could only be made in a system where loyalty was measured by enthusiasm rather than service, where any form of independence was considered subversive. Seneca's defense was characteristically thoughtful and principled. He acknowledged his gratitude for imperial favor while maintaining his right to retire from active service when his conscience demanded it. He accepted responsibility for his philosophical writings while defending their general rather than specific nature. Most importantly, he refused to implicate others in activities he himself had not undertaken, maintaining the dignity and integrity that had defined his public career even as that career approached its end. The verdict was never in doubt, but the manner of its delivery revealed something important about both men and their relationship. Nero could have simply ordered Seneca's execution, as he had done with so many others who had displeased him. Instead, he offered his former tutor the traditional Roman option of suicide, the chance to choose the manner and timing of his own death, rather than suffering the indignity of public execution. It was a small gesture of respect, perhaps the last acknowledgement of what their relationship had once meant to both of them. Seneca received the news of his death sentence with the calm composure that he had spent a lifetime cultivating. When the imperial messenger arrived at his villa outside Rome with Nero's final command, the philosopher was dining with his wife, Pompeia Paulina, and a small group of close friends. The conversation had been light, touching on literary matters and philosophical questions, the kind of intellectual discourse that had always provided Seneca with his deepest satisfaction. The interruption transformed the gathering from a pleasant social occasion into something far more solemn and significant. The order was delivered with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized imperial administration, even in its most personal moments. Seneca was to take his own life within a specified time period, the traditional 3 days that Roman custom allowed for such matters. The messenger, a centurion who had clearly performed this duty before, maintained the respectful tone appropriate when dealing with a man of Seneca's standing, but his meaning was unmistakable. This was not a request or a suggestion, but a command that would be enforced if not voluntarily obeyed. Seneca's response revealed the extent to which his philosophical training had prepared him for exactly this moment. Rather than expressing shock or attempting to negotiate, he thanked the messenger politely and asked for writing materials to compose his final letters. His friends, less prepared for such news, reacted with the kind of emotional distress that would have been natural for anyone witnessing the destruction of someone they loved and respected. But the philosopher himself seemed almost relieved, as if a burden he had been carrying for years had finally been lifted from his shoulders. The 3 days that followed became a kind of extended philosophical seminar, with Seneca using his remaining time to demonstrate, through personal example, the principles he had taught throughout his career. He spent hours dictating letters to friends and students, offering final advice and guidance for living according to Stoic principles in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to such ideals. He reviewed his will and made arrangements for his household, ensuring that his servants and dependents would be provided for after his death. Most importantly, he used the time to prepare himself mentally and spiritually for the transition he was about to make. The letters he composed during this period reveal a man who had found peace with his situation, despite its obvious injustice. Writing to Lucilius, his most devoted correspondent, Seneca explored the relationship between philosophy and death, arguing that a life lived according to virtue provided its own justification regardless of how or when it ended. He discussed the concept of preferred indifference, acknowledging that while life was generally preferable to death, circumstances could arise where choosing death became the more rational and virtuous option. These final philosophical reflections were not abstract meditations, but practical preparations for an act that would test everything Seneca believed about courage, wisdom, and the proper relationship between the soul and the body. He wrote extensively about the fear of death, analysing its sources and offering strategies for overcoming it through rational analysis and spiritual discipline. Death, he argued, was simply a natural transition, no more frightening than the countless smaller transitions that marked every human life. But perhaps most remarkably, Seneca's final letters contained very little bitterness toward Nero or the imperial system that had condemned him. Instead, they focused on the philosophical lessons that could be drawn from his situation, the ways in which his experience might serve as guidance for others facing similar challenges. He wrote about the relationship between teacher and student, acknowledging the disappointment he felt at Nero's transformation, while maintaining that the attempt to educate him had been worthwhile regardless of its ultimate failure. The practical arrangements for his death reflected the same careful attention to detail that had characterized Seneca's approach to all important matters. Roman law and custom provided established procedures for noble suicide, traditions that allowed prominent citizens to maintain their dignity even in the face of imperial displeasure. The method was typically the opening of veins in a warm bath, a process that was relatively peaceful and allowed time for final conversations and reflections. Seneca chose to follow these traditional forms, but he insisted on making the occasion serve educational as well as personal purposes. He invited a small group of friends and students to witness his death, transforming what might have been a private tragedy into a public demonstration of philosophical principles in action. The gathering would serve as his final lecture, a practical lesson in how someone who had spent their life studying virtue should face the ultimate test of their convictions. Pompeia Paulina's decision to join her husband in death created an unexpected complication that revealed the depth of their relationship and the extent to which Stoic principles had shaped their marriage. When she announced her intention to open her own veins alongside Seneca's, she was not making an emotional gesture, but a reasoned philosophical choice. She had studied the same texts, absorbed the same teachings, and reached the conclusion that life without her husband would not be worth living according to the standards they had established together. Seneca's response to his wife's decision showed both his love for her and his commitment to philosophical consistency. He neither encouraged nor discouraged her choice, recognizing that she had the same right to determine her own fate that he was exercising. Instead, he spent time discussing with her the reasoning behind her decision, ensuring that it was based on genuine philosophical conviction rather than temporary emotional distress. Their final conversations revealed a partnership that had been built on shared intellectual and spiritual foundations rather than mere affection or social convention. The presence of witnesses at their deaths was not intended as a theatrical gesture, but as a pedagogical opportunity, a chance to demonstrate through personal example what they had taught through words and writings. The small group that gathered in Seneca's villa on that final day included some of his most devoted students, men who would carry the memory of what they witnessed back into the world and use it to guide their own lives and teachings. As the appointed time approached, Seneca began the process of dying with the same systematic approach he had brought to all his intellectual endeavors. He spoke calmly about the philosophical significance of what was happening, explaining how his death represented the logical conclusion of a life lived according to Stoic principles. The fear of death, he reminded his listeners, was based on ignorance and attachment to external things. Someone who truly understood the nature of reality would face the transition from life to death with curiosity rather than terror. The physical process proved more difficult than anticipated. Seneca's advanced age and weakened constitution meant that his blood flowed slowly, prolonging what should have been a relatively quick death. Rather than expressing frustration or fear at this development, he used the extra time to continue his philosophical discourse, treating even this unexpected challenge as an opportunity for further teaching and reflection. The extended dying process allowed for conversations that might not otherwise have occurred. Seneca spoke at length about his relationship with Nero, acknowledging the failures and disappointments, while maintaining that the attempt to guide the young emperor had been necessary and worthwhile. He discussed his wealth and the accusations of hypocrisy that had followed him throughout his later career, defending his choices while admitting the moral complexities they had created. Most significantly, he used his final hours to address questions about the relationship between philosophy and political action, themes that had dominated his adult life and that continued to trouble his students and associates. Could someone maintain their virtue while participating in a corrupt system? Was it better to withdraw from public life entirely, or to remain engaged despite the moral compromises such engagement required? These were not abstract questions for the men gathered around Seneca's deathbed, but practical challenges they would face in their own careers. As his strength continued to ebb, Seneca made the decision to speed his death by drinking hemlock, following the example of Socrates centuries earlier. The parallel was intentional, a final demonstration of the connection between philosophical conviction and personal courage that had characterized both men's lives. But even this measure proved insufficient, and he ultimately chose to enter a steam bath where the heat would accelerate the process by which his life was ending. The final moments were spent in quiet conversation with those closest to him, discussing not the political events that had led to this situation, but the eternal questions that had always been at the heart of his philosophical inquiries. What was the nature of virtue? How should someone live? What constituted a meaningful existence? These conversations continued almost until the end, with Seneca maintaining his role as teacher even as his voice grew weaker and his thoughts became more fragmented. Pompeia Paulina's survival created a bittersweet epilogue to what had been planned as a joint philosophical demonstration. Nero, perhaps recognizing that allowing the wife of a condemned traitor to die alongside her husband might create unwanted martyrs, ordered his soldiers to intervene and save her life. She lived for several more years, reportedly never fully recovering from her grief and maintaining the pale complexion that resulted from her blood loss as a visible reminder of what she'd been willing to sacrifice. The news of Seneca's death spread quickly through Rome and the broader empire, creating reactions that revealed the complex legacy he had built during his decades of public service. His supporters saw him as a martyr to philosophical principle, a man who had maintained his integrity despite impossible circumstances and who had chosen death rather than compromise his fundamental beliefs. His critics viewed his suicide as the final act of hypocrisy from someone who had preached virtue while accumulating wealth and power. But perhaps more significant than these immediate reactions was the way Seneca's death influenced the broader intellectual culture of the Roman world. His final demonstration of Stoic principles in action provided a model that would inspire generations of philosophers, writers, and political figures who faced similar challenges in balancing principle with pragmatism, virtue with survival. The letters and philosophical works he had produced during his final years, many of them written with the knowledge that death was approaching, became foundational texts for later Stoic thinkers. His exploration of questions about duty, conscience, and the proper response to political oppression provided frameworks that would be used by everyone from early Christian martyrs to Renaissance humanists to modern advocates of civil disobedience. The irony of Seneca's situation was not lost on contemporary observers or later historians. The man who had spent years trying to teach Nero about virtue and the proper use of power had ultimately been killed by his students' complete rejection of those lessons. The philosopher who had written extensively about the unimportance of external goods had died partly because his wealth made him a target for imperial confiscation. The teacher who had preached about the supremacy of reason over passion had been destroyed by an emperor whose decisions were based entirely on personal whim and emotional impulse. Yet this irony did not diminish the power of Seneca's final example. If anything, it enhanced it by demonstrating that philosophical principles could maintain their validity even when they failed to achieve their intended practical results. The goal of Stoic practice was not to guarantee success in worldly terms, but to ensure that one's actions remained aligned with virtue regardless of external outcomes. The immediate aftermath of Seneca's death saw a purge of his associates and supporters as Nero attempted to eliminate anyone who might carry forward his former tutor's influence or example. But this effort proved futile in the long term. The ideas Seneca had developed and the example he had set continued to spread throughout the educated classes of the Roman Empire, carried forward by students and admirers who recognized the enduring value of his contributions to philosophy and political thought. The emperor who had ordered his death would survive him by only 3 years. Nero's reign, which had begun with such promise under Seneca's guidance, collapsed in 68 AD amid military revolts and senatorial opposition. The man who had rejected every lesson about virtue and restraint ultimately discovered that power without wisdom was unsustainable, that the respect and loyalty of subjects could not be maintained through fear and spectacle alone. But while Nero's empire crumbled and his memory became synonymous with tyranny and excess, Seneca's influence continued to grow. His philosophical works were copied and studied throughout the ancient world. His letters to Lucilius became standard texts for anyone seeking to understand Stoic principles, and his example of principled resistance to tyranny inspired countless individuals who found themselves in similar situations. The transformation of Seneca from controversial political figure to revered philosophical authority took place gradually over the centuries following his death. Early Christian writers, despite their general suspicion of pagan philosophy, found much to admire in his emphasis on virtue, his critique of material excess, and his willingness to die for his principles. Medieval scholars preserved and transmitted his works when many other classical texts were lost. Renaissance humanists rediscovered him as a model of the engaged intellectual who combined scholarly achievement with practical wisdom. This posthumous rehabilitation was based partly on the recognition that Seneca had faced moral challenges that were genuinely difficult and had navigated them with greater integrity than most people in similar situations could have managed. His willingness to serve in Nero's government, despite its obvious flaws, could be seen not as hypocrisy, but as a genuine attempt to use whatever influence he possessed to limit the damage that unconstrained power might otherwise cause. His accumulation of wealth, rather than contradicting his philosophical principles, could be understood as a practical necessity for someone operating in a system where poverty meant powerlessness and where the ability to help others often depended on having resources to deploy. His gradual withdrawal from active political involvement, far from representing cowardice or abandonment of responsibility, demonstrated the wisdom to recognize when continued participation would accomplish nothing except the corruption of his own character. Most importantly, his final choice to die rather than compromise his fundamental principles provided a powerful demonstration that philosophical conviction could triumph over the most basic human instinct for survival. The man who had spent decades writing about virtue and wisdom had ultimately proven willing to sacrifice everything, including life itself, rather than abandon the beliefs that gave his existence meaning and purpose. The story of Seneca's life and death thus became a template for understanding how someone could maintain their integrity while operating within imperfect systems, how wisdom and power could coexist despite their natural tensions, and how individual virtue could matter even when it failed to transform the broader world. These lessons remained relevant long after the specific political circumstances that had shaped his career were forgotten, providing guidance for anyone who sought to live according to principle in a world that often seemed to reward very different qualities. The death of Seneca marked the end of an extraordinary life, but it was far from the end of his story. In the months and years that followed his suicide, something remarkable happened. The man who had been criticized during his lifetime for the contradictions between his teachings and his circumstances began to be seen in a very different light. His final act of principled defiance had transformed him from a controversial political figure into something approaching a philosophical saint. The transformation began almost immediately among those who had witnessed his death or heard first-hand accounts of his final days. The calm dignity with which he had faced execution, the thoughtful preparation he had undertaken, and the educational purpose he had given to his dying all served to validate the principles he had spent his career defending. Here was proof that Stoic philosophy was not merely academic theory, but a practical guide that could sustain someone through the most extreme challenges imaginable. Word of his death spread throughout the empire with surprising speed, carried by the network of students, correspondents, and intellectual associates he had cultivated over decades of writing and teaching. These accounts emphasized not the political circumstances that had led to his condemnation, but the philosophical significance of his response to those circumstances. The man who had struggled to balance competing moral demands during his life was remembered primarily for the clarity and conviction he had shown at its end. This process of posthumous rehabilitation was aided by the rapid deterioration of Nero's reign in the years following Seneca's execution. As the emperor's behavior became increasingly erratic and destructive, and as the empire itself began to show signs of the instability that unchecked power inevitably produces, Seneca's warnings about the corrupting effects of absolute authority seemed increasingly prescient. The teacher had been proven right about his student in ways that few could have anticipated. The philosophical works that Seneca had produced during his final years, written with the knowledge that his position was precarious and his time might be limited, took on new significance in this changed context. His letters to Lucilius, in particular, were recognized as masterpieces of practical wisdom that addressed universal human concerns rather than merely contemporary political issues. These writings provided guidance that remained relevant regardless of who held power or what specific challenges readers might face in their own lives. The influence of these works extended far beyond the circles of professional philosophers who might have been expected to study them. Roman administrators serving in distant provinces found in Seneca's letters practical advice for maintaining their integrity while dealing with the moral complexities of imperial governance. Soldiers facing the possibility of death in battle discovered frameworks for understanding courage and duty that helped them cope with fear and uncertainty. Even ordinary citizens struggling with personal losses or disappointments could find comfort and guidance in his exploration of how to live according to virtue despite external circumstances beyond their control. This broad appeal was partly due to Seneca's unique background and experience. Unlike many philosophers who had spent their entire careers in academic settings, he had tested his ideas against the realities of political life at the highest levels. His writings carried the authority of someone who had actually faced the dilemmas he discussed, who had struggled with the practical application of philosophical principles in situations where the stakes were literally life and death. The early Christian community, despite its general suspicion of pagan philosophy, found much to admire in Seneca's emphasis on virtue over material success, his critique of excessive wealth and luxury, and his willingness to die rather than compromise his fundamental beliefs. Some early church fathers even suggested that he had been influenced by Christian teachings, though there is no historical evidence for direct contact between Seneca and early Christian leaders. The similarities they detected were more likely the result of parallel moral insights reached through different intellectual traditions. Medieval scholars, working to preserve and transmit the classical heritage through periods of political chaos and cultural transformation, recognized Seneca as one of the most practically valuable ancient authors. His combination of philosophical depth and practical wisdom made his works particularly useful for readers who needed guidance for living in unstable times. His letters and essays were copied and recopied throughout the medieval period, ensuring their survival when many other classical texts were lost. The Renaissance brought a renewed appreciation for Seneca's particular combination of intellectual achievement and political engagement. Humanist scholars, many of whom were themselves involved in the complex political life of Italian city-states, found in his career a model for how someone could maintain their scholarly integrity while participating actively in public affairs. His struggles with the moral compromises required by political involvement resonated with readers who faced similar challenges in their own contexts. The influence extended beyond purely intellectual circles to shape practical approaches to governance and administration throughout Europe. Political theorists studying the relationship between power and virtue found in Seneca's career both positive and negative examples of how these forces could interact. His success in moderating Nero's behavior during the early years of the reign demonstrated that philosophical wisdom could have practical political effects, while his ultimate failure and death illustrated the limits of such influence when dealing with truly corrupt leadership. The development of modern political thought owed considerable debts to frameworks that Seneca had established for understanding the relationship between individual conscience and public duty. His exploration of when someone should remain engaged with imperfect systems and when they should withdraw became foundational for later discussions of civil disobedience, conscientious objection, and the moral responsibilities of citizens under unjust governments. So we return to that villa outside Rome, to an old man bleeding slowly into warm water, his voice growing weaker with each word dictated to his secretary. Seneca's death was not just the end of one remarkable life, but the beginning of an influence that would echo through the centuries. The philosopher who had struggled to balance virtue with power, who had wrestled with the contradictions between principle and pragmatism, who had tried to teach an emperor wisdom only to be destroyed by his students' rejection of every lesson, had found in his final moments the clarity that had sometimes eluded him in life. His death became proof that philosophy was not merely academic theory, but a practical guide that could sustain someone through the ultimate test. 2,000 years later, whenever we face the choice between what is easy and what is right, we are walking in Seneca's footsteps.